Good morning, good morning. Too much children's television when I start singing that. Okay. Oh, Emily, they are not. They're not. They're so overgrown. But thank you. Just be hairy. I am. Why not? Hi, Jody. Hi, Kate. So, I wanted to jump on and chat about this question that I get asked all the time, and that is if autistic people need routine so much, then why does my child who is PDA autistic no longer follow their routine after some time of loving their routine? What a great question. So, I'm going to do my best to answer that. First of all, not all autistic people thrive on routine. Uh, some of us, despite the information out there in the textbooks, some of us are spontaneous and like a bit of risk. But the thing about PDA, this is why it's so important to have a really good understanding of how the PDA brain works. So, hi Kimberly, hi Sarah, hi Sylvie. So, what happens with the routine is for a while, for PDAs, things will go really, really well until they won't anymore. And more often than not, families or professionals, or even us ourselves, if we don't really have a good awareness around how our neurobiology operates, is we will wonder why we can no longer follow that routine. What happens with the PDA brain is that we are wired to perceive threat in a much more sensitive way than other people, even other autistic people who do not have a PDA profile. So, what this means is my threat response, the part of my brain that scans my environment and decides what is safe and what isn't, that part of my brain is activated consistently. So, those are birds outside in case people haven't seen me live before and know that there are birds. There's a lot of birds. So, what happens is the PDA threat response is activated consistently, and our responses to our environment, people, places, and things, comes from the four threat responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So, how does this play out in routines? The way that this plays out is that because we have a hypersensitive neuroception, because the PDA brain is extremely, extremely sensitive, it will perceive things as threats when they aren't necessarily threats. And we, the people with those brains, won't have a say in that. And we know that this is true because our demand avoidance, our PDA, extends to our own hobbies and the things that we want to do. So, an example of that is a PDA child who wants to be at school because they're socially motivated and they want to be with their friends, but that hypersensitive neuroception will not allow them to do so anymore. And because we're determined, we push through and we push through until we just can't. And what happens is because we're autistic as a foundation, we have a brain that's wired for understanding patterns. So when we have a routine or something that we do over and over again, ultimately what happens in the end is the PDA brain goes, okay, I've done this enough times to recognize that there is an emotional connection with this sequence of events. Now, if we think about a child who's getting ready for school, and no matter how much they want to be there, there's going to be anxiety if they're PDA autistic. They might be going through the pattern of getting up, getting brekkie, or whatever is in their routine. And it will work for some time until the brain goes, okay, I can recognize this now. I recognize that when we are doing these things, when we are moving our body in this way, when the visual sensory system is picking up on seeing the same things every day in a specific sequence, our sensory systems are identifying this pattern. The PDA brain then steps in and goes, this can't be safe, because there's an emotional or neurobiological experience that goes with it that signifies threat. Is this making sense so far? Because I don't want to keep talking if it's not making sense. And I can only see a few comments. Can't see them all like I used to be able to. Hi Brian. Hi Nicole. Oh, Facebook. I love you, but when you change, life gets hard. Okay, it's making sense. So, thank you everyone for that feedback. So, what happens is the recognition of that sequence of events will start at the very end. The closer, so we have the routine, imagine a straight line as a sequence of events, a routine. And at the end of that routine, we might be getting in the car to go to school, or we might be arriving at school. And that is when our anxiety and the depth and intensity of that emotional experience intensifies. It's when it's at its peak. So we're up here in terms of fear and anxiety. But sometimes we manage to push through and we just go anyway. But over time, the PDA brain goes, okay, I'm trying to signify to you that this is not safe and you are not listening. So it identifies earlier on in the routine that we're moving toward that peak of emotional intensity that signifies it's not safe. So instead of the PDA brain kicking in and stopping us from moving through the school gate to get to school, it'll start in the car on the way to school, where we might be saying, I can't do it, I can't go. And then if we manage to push through that, the PDA neurobiology will kick in earlier than that. So it moves further back in the routine until we wake up in the morning and we know we can't get out of bed to go to school. This is why many families will say, you know, my child was able to push through before. They could go to school, they could manage this stuff. Even when they felt anxious, they were able to push through and get out of the car and go. And I really relate to that as an adult PDA. There are many things in my life that I would push through because I credit my PDA for the determination I have. I'm very determined. Even when I'm anxious, I'm very determined. So I've been able to push through a lot of things in my life. But then what happens is, whilst we're being determined and encouraged and pushed, our capacity for being able to do anything, I should have just stopped it, being able, moves further down. We become more disabled and less capable. And this is the difficulty with PDA. Well-intentioned and well-meaning support networks get in there and encourage us and try and find strategies to help us to continue doing this thing, like getting to school or going to work if you're an adult, or going out and spending time with friends. But what's happening is there's this inherent, powerful protective system that understands its one job is to keep us alive. It doesn't care if we want to see our friends. It doesn't care if we want to go to school or work. It doesn't care if we need to earn money. It only recognizes safety and lack of safety. Danger and safety, I should say. And it just wants to keep us alive. So that threat response in the PDA doesn't care for details. It only understands a person through their actions, living or dying. And so that's why for many PDAs, the intensity of that emotional response to things can sound like, for us, it's a life or death situation, because that's what our brain communicates to us. We know that with a lot of PDAs, that process even extends to our own things that we want to engage in. If I get too excited about my own hobbies, my brain will mistake the excitement as a threat and prevent me from engaging with it until I can calm down the threat response. Now, children do not have the ability or the capacity to be able to calm down their threat response. So when we go in there well-intentioned and we encourage them, what happens is the PDA brain receives that encouragement as additional pressure, additional demands. And so this makes it harder for the PDA to move forward, and it just pushes us further away from being able to do the things that we want to do. I'm just going to check the comments. Oh, there's lots now. I must have had like an influx of comments. Hi, Jessie. Hi, Rafaela. Hi, Joanne. Yeah. I never thought of it the way you're explaining it today. It's not often spoken about at a neurobiological level. We do a lot of talking about PDA around what a person can and can't do, but we don't talk enough about what's happening for them on a neurobiological level. I know I use that word a lot, but when we only talk about what a child will and won't do, or compliance or non-compliance, or we only look at their behaviour, people make assumptions that that behaviour is driven by intention, and it's not. Thank you for explaining this. I'm thinking about it in relation to adults and connections and relationships as well. Is this something you go into as well? Yeah, I've done a webinar on this, Jessica, on relationships and PDA. Yeah. Yes, Jessica, this is so important. So, Jessica has said, can this be linked to trauma responses as well? Yes. So, what happens here is then when I was saying before that we're pushing through, as PDAs, we're pushing through until we cannot anymore and we're disabled, completely disabled, cannot come out of our room, can't shower, can't brush our teeth, can't choose what we want to eat, all of that stuff. We don't recognize and we don't realize that trauma is setting in. Trauma. This is the process that results from consistently pushing through, being in survival mode. Because when we're going to school or we're showing up for work or we're pushing ourselves to do things, even when we want to do them, we're still going against that natural PDA way of being. And so trauma absolutely sets in. Is this likely because a new, not necessarily identified threat has presented itself? That can happen as well, Jackie, absolutely. I feel like I'm seeing this in my oldest. Is it getting harder? Oh, it is getting harder for him to get to the door and ready for school. Yeah. Gosh, this is so heartbreakingly familiar. We are almost 3 years out from those terribly hard days with my teenage daughter, and it still hurts. It hurts that I didn't know what was happening. How could we know, Tanya? How could we know? This is an internalized process, and it's taken me 40 odd years to work it out in myself, and I'm a PDA. I've made all the same judgments and presumptions as all other families. So I hear you. It does hurt. It really hurts. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that I sent my one of my teenagers, a text message and said, you know, I'm so sorry. I will forever be so sorry for what I didn't know. I know now, and I'm doing my best to do differently as a parent, but I just didn't know. How could we know? We're doing what we believe is best at the time. And a lot of the time, we're also doing what we're encouraged to do by professionals who don't understand PDA. Sometimes we don't even know our kids are PDAs. Jude says, so is this why it can take so long for recovery? After years of pushing through to get to school, then being in shutdown for over 2 years. Yes, absolutely. And this is something that's so important too. When our children get to the point where they cannot even leave their room to go to school, or they can't get out of the house to go to school, it's really important for recovery time. And this links back to trauma as well. Trauma, the understanding of what trauma is, prevents people from acknowledging it in PDAs. And trauma is most often understood as something that occurs after someone has experienced a significant event that was stressful or distressing. It's so much more than that. Trauma can be a range of things. PDAs are very easily tipped over into a trauma state. So it does require a lot of recovery time. And sometimes it's really challenging for families and professionals to get on board with allowing their children that time, because what it can look like is letting them have a very, well, not letting them, providing them a very low to no demand environment where they get to sleep, where their sleep patterns may change because they may feel safer to be awake during the night and asleep all day. They may need additional screen time. I mean, it's really complex to cover a lot of stuff in one sitting, but recovery time can take weeks, months, years. It really depends. Sienna says, my kiddo has never been the same. I'm really sorry to hear that, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly too. There are so many families that say this, that their children have never been the same, or they haven't seen them smile or heard them laugh in years. But it will return. It will absolutely return if we allow that recovery time, and it just can take a really long time. just going through the comments, and thanks for bearing with me. Hi, Hannah. Hannah says, I've been experiencing demand avoidance because of existential depression during the pandemic. Have you seen this connection? Yes. I want to touch on something that I've just spoken about in a podcast interview. Something I see a lot is the use of demand avoidance. And there are so many different forms of demand avoidance. There's demand avoidance that comes with ADHD and executive functioning. There's demand avoidance that comes with burnout, autistic burnout. There's demand avoidance that comes with trauma. There's demand avoidance that comes with autistic inertia. There's so many different forms of demand avoidance. And sometimes I see demand avoidance confused with PDA, pathological demand avoidance. Pathological is a bloody awful word, but it's the one that we have for the time being. Um, it's not pathological. Pervasive, yes. Pathological, no. But PDA is an entire neurobiology. It's not just an autistic person with demand avoidance, and I hear it referred to like that all the time. And, I absolutely respect the language that other people are comfortable using, but I want to make um, clear that there are many types of demand avoidance, and PDA is usually present across a person's lifespan. I think I had demand avoidance before because I was always motivated by special interests and passions, but now the pandemic has made things so difficult. Yeah, I understand, Hannah. I'm really sorry to hear that. The pandemic had a lot of impact on people's mental health, most definitely. And I think that demand avoidance definitely has been something that people have experienced as a result. When you talk about an emotional response to a routine, do you mean it just becomes another demand? Is it good to change routines? It seems like routines change organically with my son and we try to go with it. Great question, Betsy. When I talk about an emotional response, I mean crippling anxiety. So when I was a teenager, and even a preteen, I didn't know I was autistic, but I also didn't know that I lived with chronic anxiety. I had no idea because I had nothing to compare that to. That was my life experience. But I knew that I couldn't eat in the mornings before school. I knew I felt scared, and I knew that I struggled to brush my teeth because the overwhelming anxiety would make me dry retch. I would gag when I was trying to brush my teeth. The chronic anxiety for me also meant that I couldn't focus on parts of my routine because I was so, I don't even have a language for it. I don't think that, frozen, I guess, from the anxiety. So I was going through the motions, but I was not really present, if that makes sense. But I still went to school. I still got things done. I still pushed through, and I experienced all of this internalized, awful, chronic anxiety that was just debilitating. But nobody had a clue because I'd still put on a smile and go to school. I'd still mask. And so that's what I'm talking about. That's the response. It's not necessarily an emotional response to the routine itself, it's a response that occurs at some point of the routine. So the example I used is if we're putting our 8-year-old in the car to go to school, that might be the point where they say, I don't want to go to school. Or they might say, I feel sick. or I have a headache, or I have a sore throat, or they might come up with something to avoid going to school. The next part of your question is really great. Is it good to change routines? So there's a few different things that we can do to help. But before we get into that, I want to make it really clear. My husband's sending me a text message, so I'm just going to check that in case. Sorry about that. We have sick children at home at the moment. It's important for people to acknowledge that when PDAs are not able to go to school or do something like that, we give them breathing space, or we don't try and find ways to force, because that can do more harm than good. I also absolutely acknowledge that there are people who don't have that luxury, that there are people that must go to work, that must have their children in school, and I understand that. There's a few, I guess the way that I help my children and myself through situations that feel really difficult but are things that we want to engage in is by communicating through my sensory systems. So, excuse me, we do this thing where we have sounds on. Say if we want to go to the beach, we have sounds of waves crashing in the background. We don't talk about it. We don't ever have conversations about it, just sounds of waves crashing in the background. We might put something on TV in the background of people at the beach laughing and having fun and having a great time. We don't talk about it, we just have it on the TV. We might have smells in our house, whether that be through oils or candles or whatever, that resemble the beach. We might have shells, or we might go and play in the sandpit together to get our body used to experiencing elements from that environment, the beach, while we're in a safe space. So then the brain is able, when we're in a safe space and we are de-escalated, the brain is able to make the connection that touching sand or seeing sand or smelling sand, or for many children tasting sand, is a safe thing. Is this making sense so far? I'll just keep talking because I know I've been talking for a long time. So, this is something that we do at home. We communicate to our brain through our sensory systems. The threat response doesn't understand language, so you can't communicate with the threat response with language. And I know that a lot of people try this with PDAs. I remember back before I knew what I know now, one of my children would email me from school and say, I can't do this, I want to come home, or, I feel so anxious, I don't know what's wrong with me. And I would just respond in email and I would say, anxiety is a normal way for the body to keep us alive. And I'd just try and support them with language. And it didn't work. Affirmations and things like that just didn't work because the threat response didn't recognize verbal language. The way that we communicate with our threat response is through our sensory systems. We have to communicate with the threat response with its language. So the beach example is one thing. In terms of routine, this can be something for me as simple as going for a walk every day and really enjoying it, but then maybe I might hear a dog barking or something and it might be loud and my threat response might go off. So then all of a sudden what will happen is the next day I'll lay in bed and my brain will tell me, walking's crap anyway. I don't want to go for a walk. Nope. And this isn't for everyone. We're speaking specifically about PDA right now. And I won't understand that. I'll just go, oh yeah, don't want to go for a walk. Because the threat response will employ any strategies it can to prevent us from engaging with something it doesn't see as safe. So what I'd have to do then is sit with that discomfort, really explore where it's coming from, backtrack and think about it, and I might not even know. But what I would do is I'd go on a different route. I'd walk a different way, and then I'll be okay. Doesn't always work, but it's changing things up. In a morning routine for a child, sometimes all we have to do is throw in one difference to throw that threat response off track. And it might be having an amazing breakfast that we don't normally have. Who wants pancakes for breakfast when usually we have Vegemite on toast? If you're in Australia. It could be something like going a different way to school, riding a bike to school instead of going in the car. I know with one of our children who really wanted to be at school and couldn't get through the gate for an extended time, what we started doing was taking them around the back of the school and they'd go in no problem. But this is why we always change up routine with PDAs. Things will work until they don't, and then we just have to explore a different way of doing things. Stacey says, I would love to learn more about positive affirmations. Oh, Liz, I hope you have a brilliant time. Liz says, we will start with the sensory beach idea today. We're going in a week. Have a great time. My son gets suspended because he lashes out. He's getting so frustrated with nobody understanding him. Yeah, this is really hard. Really hard. That lashing out is panic. It's terror. It is intensified threat. This incredible understanding of it's this intense experience that the body locks into to prevent us from what it believes is dying. And when we're children, we don't understand what's happening. So there's us and there's our brain, and this is what's happening with our brain and our body. And here's us terrified at what's happening because we have additional pressure on the outside from educators or parents or whoever saying, what are you doing? Don't do that. You need to calm down. You need to do this. How about we try this? And this threat response doesn't care about what all those people are trying to do to help. It just fires up the child more and more because of the pressure, the additional pressure. Yeah. Thank you, Emily. That's really kind. Yeah. I'm just going back. I'm about to finish up. Just going back and checking comments. Is this a separate diagnosis? I know PDA is a part of an autistic profile, but how do you work it out? I think most people work it out because they have children who do not respond well to some of the supports and approaches we offer autistic people. Now, when I say that, I want to make this very clear. Some of the supports and approaches we offer autistic people are not good. Things like ABA therapy, social skills intervention, anything that seeks to uh, drive an autistic child toward neuronormative standards or change who they are, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things like having a visual schedule sometimes can be triggering for a PDA. Their inability to comply with daily tasks that other people can do without thinking about brushing teeth, using the toilet without having accidents, um, fears and phobias, incredible anxiety, a need to be balanced all the time, which comes across as a need to be in control. Um, yeah, it really depends on the individual. It's not really a diagnosis either, Deb. It's we would generally go to somebody who understands PDA for one, and we'd be assessed for autism, and they would identify whether it looks like PDA profile. Okay. Hi, Summer. Me avoiding routine now. It is in the middle of the night here in Norway. Can PDA just come to the surface at about 40? Can I have been masking for so long? You can be masking and fawning. You can be a fawning PDA or an introverted PDA. I think there is a stereotype attached to PDA, which is usually a child that's lashing out, climbing the walls, is violent, aggressive. PDA doesn't always, it's not always expressed that way. For me personally, I masked and I fawned and I was raging under the surface for many years. There were years where I was violent and aggressive and I had trouble at school. I left school at 15. I experienced being put in isolation at school and being in trouble all the time. But I think the internalized experience is the key here. And when you get to adulthood and you've been masking and fawning all your life, we often don't know who we are. So many people who are diagnosed in adulthood have extremely poor mental health and chronic health conditions, co-occurring conditions. They've often been misdiagnosed, and so it is the beginning of an exploration of neurodivergent identity. So being immersed in neurodivergent community with other autistic adults is really helpful. But absolutely, you can start to tap into who you truly are and who you were supposed to be all along in your 40s. Yeah. I've met women who have been diagnosed or identified autistic in their 60s and 70s. Okay. How did my parents handle my PDA? They did the best they could. My parent was a sole parent who did the best that they could. In the 80s and the early 90s, we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't know what we know now. And They did the best they could. So my parent got me involved in community things that were associated with my interests. I hated that. I absolutely hated it. But I did it because I wanted approval. I wanted to be accepted. And I think my mum did the best that she could. There was no support. There was just no support. And I think that, as I got older, because I had trauma from school and being put in isolation and being on behavioural modification programs, and because I wasn't identified as being autistic or ADHD or PDA, I was just seen as a bad kid, behaviourally challenged kid. And it was not a nice way to be. So I think as I got older, I tried to feel better about that by self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And yeah, I didn't have a very good time as a teenager. Um, and I did end up in trouble with the police and all sorts of stuff. But my mother had very little support, very little capacity, worked full time, sometimes 7 days a week, and was raising other children as well. So, it wasn't perfect, but it was the best that she could do. And being a mother myself, I've learnt that. I have learnt that. Okay, everyone. I've been talking for nearly 45 minutes. I get sick of the sound of my own voice. Sending you all love. Mwah. I'm going to engage in my membership program now. I think I was going to mention that earlier actually, and I haven't, but we have a private membership space. It's taking new members at the moment. Intune Access Support Family Collective. We have a beautiful little Facebook group, and we have an online forum if you don't like Facebook groups. And I drop content in there every week. We have fortnightly catch-ups on Zoom with our coffee, and we chat away, and it's just a really beautiful space. I'll pop a link in the comments section. Thank you so much, everyone. Sending lots of love. Mwah!